The moment you realize the person you promised forever to has chosen someone else feels like drowning in slow motion. Victoria stood in her parents' living room, the diamond engagement ring suddenly heavy as a stone in her trembling hand, and watched her mother's face crumble like the life they'd been planning together. 3 months of wedding preparations, a guest list of 500, her entire future mapped out in color-coded spreadsheets, all of it, erased by a 15-minute phone call from her fiancé, who'd met someone more aligned with his vision. She wanted to feel angry, but what consumed her instead was a hollow, aching shame, as if his rejection meant there was something fundamentally wrong with her. For 2 weeks, Victoria didn't leave her apartment. She called in sick to work, ignored her friends, attempts to pull her into girls' nights and revenge fantasies, and instead existed in that gray space between heartbreak and self-pity. She wore the same sweatpants for 7 days straight. She binged reality television and cried at commercials about paper towels. Her reflection in the mirror became something she avoided, certain that anyone who looked close enough would see the proof of her worthlessness written across her face. It was her mother's intervention that finally dragged her back into the world. "You're going to volunteer at the community center," her mother announced, appearing at her door with the kind of determination that couldn't be argued with. "You always wanted to help people. Stop feeling sorry for yourself and actually do it." Victoria wanted to protest, wanted to explain that she had no capacity for generosity right now, that her cup wasn't just empty, it had shattered on the kitchen floor. But something in her mother's eyes, something desperate and loving, made her grab a jacket and follow. The community center was housed in an old brick building on the edge of the city, the kind of place that had been forgotten by urban renewal. Victoria was assigned to help with the evening meals program, and that first night, as she ladled soup into bowls with mechanical precision, she barely noticed the people across the counter. They were simply faces attached to empty bowls, a task to complete, until she looked up and saw him. He was thin in a way that suggested it wasn't a choice. His clothes layered in a fashion that had nothing to do with style and everything to do with surviving the autumn cold. But his eyes were bright, almost impossibly kind, and when he smiled at her, it reached all the way into those tired eyes. "Thank you for this," he said, as if she'd given him something precious instead of a bowl of chicken and vegetable soup. "You have no idea what this means." Something shifted in Victoria's chest, something she couldn't explain. Maybe it was the genuine gratitude, so different from the entitlement she'd grown up around. Maybe it was the way he looked at her like she mattered, like her presence was somehow significant to him. She found herself ladling him an extra portion, tucking some rolls on the edge of his tray, and when he left, she watched him go. He came back the next night, and the next, always with that same grateful smile, always with some small kindness to offer in return, helping her wipe down tables, telling her jokes that weren't particularly funny but somehow made her laugh anyway. His name was Marcus, he told her during their 3rd week of encounters. He'd been through some rough times, was between jobs and housing, but he was working toward getting back on his feet. He spoke about his circumstances, with a lack of bitterness, that Victoria found almost mystifying. How could someone with so little manage to carry so much grace? She began looking forward to her volunteer shifts in a way that surprised her. The hole that Marcus had fallen into had a name, and it was her life. Her friends were starting to move past the engagement drama, were pressuring her to download dating apps and try speed dating. The idea repulsed her. What did she want with another man trying to build a life with a checklist? She wanted this, these conversations over shared work, this sense of purpose, this unexpected lightness that Marcus's presence somehow granted her. When Marcus mentioned almost casually that he was going to leave the city for a job opportunity upstate, something in Victoria fractured. She realized in that moment that she'd been waiting for something without knowing what she was waiting for. Not romance exactly, though there was something there, something deeper than simple attraction. She'd been waiting for a reason to believe in kindness again, in the fundamental goodness of people. Marcus represented that to her. "Come with me," he said. And it wasn't a proposal, not really. It was an invitation into a different kind of life she had no rational reason to accept. Her friends thought she'd lost her mind. Her parents assumed it was a phase. But Victoria found herself saying yes before her sensible self could raise objections. They got married at City Hall on a Tuesday with two strangers as witnesses. She wore a cream-colored dress from a department store, and Marcus wore a suit he'd borrowed from a friend. There were no flowers, no choir, no celebration with 500 people. There was just the two of them, making a choice that flew in the face of every careful plan she'd ever made. The first 6 months were harder than she expected. The apartment they rented was small. The job Marcus found barely paid more than minimum wage, and the life she'd constructed seemed impossibly distant. But she'd never been happier. She discovered that she liked waking up early to make coffee for someone else, liked the collaboration of their small struggles, liked the person she became when she was beside him. She started working full-time at the community center and eventually took a position managing their entire volunteer program. Marcus worked construction, his hands becoming rough and calloused, but his eyes never losing that particular brightness. Nearly 2 years into their marriage, Victoria answered the door one evening to find a lawyer holding an envelope. She almost threw it away, assuming it was junk mail. Inside was the documentation of a trust, a will, and a letter in handwriting that made her knees weak. Marcus's grandfather had passed away, and the estate, worth just over $3 million, had been left in its entirety to Marcus. Except Marcus had been estranged from his family since he was 18, didn't know his grandfather was even still alive, and had been living on the streets for the better part of a decade. When she showed him the documents, Marcus sat very still. Then he held out his hand and pulled her down beside him. "I'm so glad I didn't tell you," he said quietly. "I was so ashamed of where I came from, who I'd become. I kept waiting for the right moment to explain everything." He turned to look at her, and she saw the tears in his eyes. "But meeting you, marrying you, it showed me that none of that mattered. You loved me when I had nothing. That's worth more than anything this inheritance could ever be." They didn't need the money, not really. But they used it anyway, to expand the community center, to fund a job training program, to build the life they'd been creating together, just with more resources now. Victoria sometimes thought about her canceled engagement, about the woman she'd been at 25, so certain that her worth was determined by a man's choice and a perfect wedding. She'd been wrong about so many things, but she'd been right about one thing. There existed in the world a kind of love that came quietly, that asked nothing and gave everything, that could arrive in the most unexpected forms if you were brave enough to let go of your preconceived notions of what your life should look like. When people asked her how she'd known that Marcus was the one, she never could quite explain it. How do you describe recognizing your own capacity for goodness reflected back at you? How do you explain that sometimes the greatest loves aren't the ones that were planned, but the ones that find you when you've stopped looking, in the moments when you finally understand that you have so much more to give than you ever realized you had?